3 times a day, what the rancher did next changed history. Begun to touch the edges of his small wooden farmhouse, when he swung his legs off the bed, the worn floorboards creaking under his weight. The smell of earth and dry grass drifted through the open window, a smell he had grown to love over the years. It was the smell of life, of the land he had known since he was a boy. Living on the ranch was not just a job for John. It was a way of life, something that shaped his every thought, every move. Every morning, the first thing he did was pull on his boots, the leather soft from years of wear, and grab his old straw hat. The hat was faded from sun, rain, and wind, but it was his shield against the harsh Texas sun that would beat down on him later in the day. He didn't need to rush. He knew the land like the back of his hand. He knew which cows liked which patch of grass, which fence posts were weak, and where the creek ran shallow. This knowledge had been passed down to him from his father and grandfather, who had told him the same words every morning. The land will tell you what it needs. You just have to listen. John stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. It was quiet, except for the soft sound of the wind brushing through the tall grass and the distant lowing of cattle. The ranch stretched for miles in every direction, a patchwork of fields and fences, dotted with trees and the occasional old barn. Each section of the ranch had its own personality, as if the land itself had moods. Some days it looked golden, basking in the sunlight, and other days, after a storm, it appeared dark and brooding. John walked slowly along the dirt path toward the first group of cattle. His eyes scanned the herd carefully, looking for any sign of trouble. A cow limping slightly, a calf lagging behind, anything out of the ordinary. 3 times a day he made these walks, like clockwork. Once in the early morning, once in the late afternoon, and once again in the evening before the sun sank completely behind the hills. Some people thought it was excessive, but John believed in the power of routine. Each visit was a conversation with the land, a way to notice small changes before they became big problems. Every hoofprint in the soil, every bent branch, every shift in the color of the grass told a story. John had learned to read these stories over decades, and he never ignored them. The morning walks were his favorite. The world felt new at that hour, and there was a kind of magic in the quiet. Birds sang from the trees, and the dew clung to the grass like tiny jewels. John liked to pause and listen to the soft whispers of the wind, letting it carry his thoughts away from the small worries of the day. He often thought about his grandfather, who had once walked these same fields with him as a boy. "Pay attention," his grandfather would say. "Nature doesn't rush, and neither should you." Those words had stayed with John all his life. As he approached the cattle, he greeted each one by name, calling out softly. It might have looked strange to someone else, but he believed that animals responded to care and attention. Some of the older cows would come closer, nudging his hand for a scratch behind the ears. The calves would run in circles, full of energy, and John would chuckle, watching them tumble in the grass. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved the ranch so much. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it connected him to something larger than himself. After checking on the herd, John moved on to the fences. Walking along the wooden posts, he inspected each one carefully. Some were old and brittle, some were strong and steady. He carried a small hammer and a few nails in his pocket, just in case he needed to make quick repairs. The fences weren't just barriers to keep the cattle in. They were a symbol of care and order. Every post he strengthened was a promise that he would protect the land and the animals that depended on it. By mid-morning, the sun climbed higher, warming the land, and John would make his way back to the farmhouse. He paused to pick up a few wildflowers growing along the path, simple yellow blooms that reminded him of his mother's garden when he was a boy. He placed them in a small jar on the kitchen table, a touch of color in the otherwise earthy tones of the farmhouse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and baked bread. John liked things simple, predictable, comforting. Breakfast was quiet, usually just a piece of bread, some cheese, and a cup of coffee. He ate slowly, savoring the taste and thinking about the day ahead. Even during these simple moments, his mind wandered over the fields and the fences, the cattle and the creek. He made mental notes of anything unusual, like a patch of grass turning brown earlier than normal, or a tree leaning at an odd angle. These small details mattered. They often made the difference between a healthy herd and one in danger, between a fence standing firm or collapsing in a storm. After breakfast, John would head out again, this time to the tool shed and the barn. He checked the equipment, oiling gears, sharpening blades, and making sure everything was ready for the day. A broken tool could slow him down, or even put him at risk. He treated his tools with respect, much like he did the land. Each tool had a history, a purpose, and he used it with care. The barn itself held memories. Old photographs of his family hung on the walls, and the smell of hay and leather was comforting, a reminder that he was part of a long line of people who had worked this land. By late morning, the heat began to climb. The work became harder, the sun more relentless. But John didn't complain. He rested briefly under the shade of an old oak tree, drinking water from his canteen and watching the cattle graze. Sometimes he would take out a small notebook and jot down observations. He recorded everything: which cows were gaining weight, which calves were growing too slowly, where the grass was thickest or thinnest. Over time, these notes created a map of the ranch, a living record of patterns and changes that only he could understand. Even as the day wore on, John's focus never wavered. By early afternoon, he walked again, checking fences and gates, making sure nothing had shifted in the sun or wind. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative. There was a rhythm to his life, a pattern that brought comfort. The routine was not boring. It was a way to stay connected to something real, something that could not be controlled by schedules, money, or technology. It was a world entirely his own. Neighbors sometimes asked why he bothered to be so meticulous. "It's just a fence," they would say, or "those cows will be fine." But John knew better. The small actions, the attention to detail, the habit of walking the land 3 times a day, these were what kept the ranch alive. He had seen what neglect could do, even for a day, and he was determined never to allow it. His family's legacy depended on it, but more than that, his own sense of purpose depended on it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, John walked one last time. The ranch looked different in the fading light, almost golden, almost magical. The cattle were calmer, the air cooler, and the wind carried the faint smell of evening flowers. John paused, listening to the soft rustle of leaves, feeling the weight of responsibility and the quiet joy of a day well spent. He knew tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Returning to the farmhouse, he wiped his boots, hung his hat, and poured himself a cup of tea. He sat by the window, watching the stars begin to appear in the clear night sky. The routine, the hard work, the quiet moments, they all connected him to the land, to the life he had chosen, and to the generations that had come before him. He understood, more than anyone, that greatness often came not from a single grand act, but from the small, consistent choices made every day. 3 times a day, he walked. 3 times a day, he observed, repaired, and nurtured. And in those simple, repeated actions, John McAllister felt the heartbeat of the ranch, the pulse of the land, and the deep satisfaction of a life lived in harmony with the world around him. The summer that year was hotter than usual. The sky stretched endlessly above the ranch, pale blue and cloudless, and the sun beat down on the dry, cracked earth with a force that seemed unrelenting. John McAllister noticed it immediately during his morning rounds. The creek, the lifeline of the ranch, had dropped more than he had ever seen in all his years. Its shallow waters barely trickled between rocks, leaving wide stretches of dry, sun-baked soil. He knelt by the water, letting his hand brush against the remaining stream. The coolness he expected was gone, replaced by a faint warmth. His brow furrowed. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself. It wasn't just the heat or the dry season. John had witnessed droughts before, and while they were always difficult, the creek had never dried up like this so early in the year. He rose slowly, scanning the land around him. The cattle were restless, moving from patch to patch in search of water and grass. A few of the older cows were clearly weaker than usual, their ribs showing slightly beneath their hides. Even the calves, usually full of life and energy, wandered with a slower gait, occasionally stopping to lie down in the dirt, exhausted by the heat. He walked upstream, following the creek's path, checking every turn, every bend, and every dam or diversion he could find. The creek should have widened in certain areas, filling natural pools and feeding smaller streams. Instead, the water disappeared too quickly, vanishing into dry soil long before it reached the familiar spots. He made notes in his small notebook, jotting down the water levels and the dates. His handwriting was careful, precise, almost obsessive, but that was the only way he could track something as unpredictable as nature. Days passed, and the situation worsened. Each morning, John found the creek even lower. The cattle began to fight over the limited water, their movements growing tense, and he realized he had to act before the herd suffered serious consequences. He rode his old horse along the edges of the property, looking beyond his land, scanning the neighboring ranches. Some of them had small irrigation systems, and he suspected that water was being redirected upstream, though he couldn't be certain. He knew confronting the issue would not be easy. Powerful agricultural corporations controlled much of the water in the area, and their operations sometimes affected small ranchers like him. John spent the afternoons inspecting every inch of his property, making repairs where necessary, reinforcing weak fences, and ensuring the cattle had enough grazing areas. He carried extra water in barrels for the most vulnerable animals, especially the calves. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that his efforts were only temporary solutions. He needed to find the source of the problem. Neighbors began to notice his concern. One morning, as John checked a fence line near the northern pasture, his friend and fellow rancher Sam Turner rode up. Sam was a larger man, jovial by nature, but even he looked worried that day. "John, the creek's barely running on my side too," he said, spurring his horse closer. "We're lucky we've got rain barrels, but if this keeps up," he trailed off, leaving the fear unspoken. John nodded solemnly. "I've seen this before, Sam, but not like this. Something upstream is changing the flow, I think. I'll find out what's causing it." He turned back toward the creek, his mind already racing with plans. He could not let the land suffer, nor the animals, nor the families that depended on it. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and he was determined to protect it. Over the next few weeks, John became almost obsessive. He rose before dawn, checking the creek, the fields, and the fences. Midday, he repaired equipment, reinforced weak spots, and measured water levels. By evening, he walked along the dry creek bed, inspecting every inch, looking for clues. He spoke little to anyone during this time. His neighbors saw his focus and determination, but didn't fully understand the depth of his concern. John didn't explain much. Words alone couldn't fix what was happening. actions would. One morning, he noticed something unusual upstream. A large section of the riverbank previously untouched had been dug up, creating a new channel. It looked deliberate, man-made, and he knew immediately that this was part of the problem. Someone was diverting water from the creek, and it was affecting all the ranches downstream. John clenched his fists, his mind working quickly. He couldn't confront it directly yet. He needed evidence. He had to be careful, smart, and patient. One wrong step could lead to more trouble than he could handle. John returned home late that afternoon, exhausted but determined. He prepared a plan. First, he needed detailed records of the creek's flow over time, so he could show exactly how the diversion was affecting the land and the cattle. He set up markers along the creek, noting water levels, soil conditions, and cattle behavior. He even took photographs, using an old camera he had repaired himself. Every day, 3 times a day, he would check the creek and update his records. The routine that had always been part of his life now became a mission. Evenings were quiet but tense. John sat on the porch, sipping coffee, staring at the darkening sky. He thought about his father and grandfather, remembering their words about listening to the land. He realized they had prepared him for moments like this. Times when the ranch demanded not just hard work, but careful observation, critical thinking, and patience. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, heavier than ever. Every decision mattered. Every action could make a difference. As the days turned into weeks, John noticed small signs of stress in the animals in the fields. The grass in some areas turned brown and brittle. Some cows developed sores from lying on the hot ground too long. The calves were slower, weaker, and less playful. John knew that without water, the consequences would grow more severe. He was determined not to let it get to that point. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening, he went to the creek, recording details, studying the changes, and adjusting his plans. Sometimes he climbed the small hills around the creek to get a better view. From there, he could see the river winding through the landscape, the patches of green grass, the trees, and the dry areas. The bigger picture helped him understand how the water flowed, where it was disappearing, and how he might redirect it. John knew that observation was as important as action. Before making any changes, he had to know exactly what was happening and why. By the end of the month, John had built a comprehensive record. His notebook was filled with dates, measurements, sketches, and observations. He had mapped the creek in detail, identifying every bend, pool, and dry section. He had also noticed patterns in the cattle's behavior when they drank less water, grazed less, and rested more. He realized that small changes in the creek could have big effects downstream, not just on his ranch, but on all the land surrounding it. One hot afternoon, John made a decision. He would not wait for someone else to fix the problem. He would take matters into his own hands. But before acting, he had to plan carefully. The solution had to be precise, delicate, and sustainable. He could not simply dig new channels or force water to flow. It could backfire. His knowledge of the land and his careful observations would be his guide. Evening fell, painting the sky with deep oranges and purples. John stood by the creek, looking at the low water and the cattle drinking cautiously from the shallow pools. He felt a mix of frustration, worry, and determination. The ranch was alive, but it was fragile, and he understood, more than ever, that his actions in the coming days could make a difference not just for the animals and the land, but for the future of the ranch itself. That night, John stayed up late, planning. He reviewed his notes, made sketches of the creek, and thought about materials he could use to redirect water safely. He considered every detail: gravity, soil composition, water pressure, and the paths of the cattle. Every step had to be carefully calculated. He knew that even a small mistake could worsen the situation, and he refused to let that happen. As the stars appeared in the sky, John finally closed his notebook. Exhausted but focused, he whispered to himself, 3 times a day, I'll check. I'll observe, I'll act, and will survive. The words were not just about the creek. They were about his entire life on the ranch, the lessons passed down from generations, and the responsibility he had inherited. He felt a quiet confidence settle over him. He was ready. The next morning, John rose before dawn as usual. The air was still warm from the previous day, and a soft breeze carried the faint scent of the wildflowers along the creek. He walked along the banks, checking the water levels and making notes. Every detail mattered. Every observation could help him solve the problem. And even as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the fields, John felt a sense of purpose stronger than the heat, the dryness, or the challenges ahead. He knew the journey would not be easy. He knew that the path ahead required patience, cleverness, and determination. But John McAllister had faced challenges before, and he had learned that careful observation, consistent effort, and respect for the land could overcome almost anything. The creek might be low, and the heat might be harsh, but he was ready to face the problem head-on. John McAllister had spent weeks observing the creek, noting every change in water flow, studying the patterns of the cattle, and marking the areas of dry soil. Now, after countless walks and careful calculations, he knew what had to be done. The creek was not just a body of water. It was the lifeline of the ranch, and the cattle, the land, and the crops depended on it. He could no longer wait. Action was necessary, and John had a plan. He rose early one morning before the first light of dawn touched the fields. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wild grass and dust. John grabbed his notebook, a sturdy shovel, a small pickaxe, and a coil of rope. He had also collected boards and barrels from the barn. Every tool and material had a purpose, chosen carefully after days of thinking about how to redirect the water safely. Today, he would begin to work not just for survival, but for the long-term health of the ranch. The first step was to clear a narrow path along the creek where water could flow more freely. The dry soil was hard and cracked, but John worked steadily, digging channels that would guide the water toward the areas where it was most needed. Sweat dripped from his brow, but he paid it no mind. He moved with precision, measuring each cut, checking the slope of the ground, and adjusting the channel as needed. Every action was deliberate. As he worked, the cattle watched him curiously from a distance. The older cows stood still, as if understanding that something important was happening. The calves tentatively approached, but John kept them at a safe distance, knowing that any sudden movement could undo hours of careful work. Even the birds seemed to sense the change, fluttering above him in the soft morning light. By late morning, John had created the first small diversion. Water that had once pooled and stagnated in a shallow bend of the creek began to move. The flow was slow at first, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to signal progress. John knelt beside the channel, letting his fingers trail in the trickling water. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. He noted the results in his notebook, comparing the water levels to his previous measurements. Everything was according to plan. The next step involved reinforcing the banks of the creek to prevent erosion. John used boards and rocks to stabilize the edges, creating a stronger path for the water to travel. He worked carefully, testing each placement to ensure it would hold under pressure when the water increased. His knowledge of the land and the materials at hand guided him. Years of experience told him what would work and what might fail. There was no room for error. As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified, But John continued without pause. He paused only briefly to drink water from his canteen, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand before resuming work. By midday, the first signs of success were visible. The cattle began to move toward the newly flowing water, drinking with renewed energy. The grass near the channel appeared greener, nourished by the trickling stream. John smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction, but he knew the work was far from finished. In the afternoon, John turned his attention upstream. He needed to ensure that no more water was being diverted improperly. Using his observations from previous weeks, he identified a small channel that had been created by someone upstream, redirecting water away from the ranch. John could not stop the diversion entirely, but he could compensate for it. He dug carefully, creating a new channel that would guide the water back toward the creek. It was delicate work. One wrong move and the soil could collapse, or the water could flow too quickly, washing away the effort of hours. By evening, John had completed most of the major work. The creek was flowing steadily again, guided along the paths he had created. He stepped back to observe the results. The cattle were calmer, grazing and drinking without fear. The fields, once dry and brittle, showed small patches of green where the water had returned. Even the air seemed fresher, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and renewed life. John felt a quiet pride. He had faced the problem head-on and had begun to solve it. But John knew the effort could not stop there. He needed to monitor the results carefully, continuing his routine of checking the creek 3 times a day. The water might shift, channels could collapse, or new problems could appear. His notebook became a vital tool, filled with diagrams, measurements, and notes about the flow and the land. Every day he recorded what had changed and what still needed attention. The routine that had once been a habit now became a lifeline for the ranch. Over the next few days, John fine-tuned the channels and diversions. He added small dams in strategic locations, using barrels and rocks to control the flow of water. He built tiny reservoirs to store water for the driest patches, ensuring that the cattle could drink even when the creek slowed. He adjusted the slopes of the channels to prevent erosion and to maximize the water reaching every section of the ranch. Each adjustment was based on careful observation and thoughtful planning. Neighbors began to notice the changes. Sam Turner came riding over one afternoon, curiosity in his eyes. "John," he said, "I see water running in places it hasn't been for weeks. What are you doing?" John smiled but said little. Action spoke louder than words. Sam dismounted and walked with him along the creek, watching how the water flowed through the new channels. "You've done something incredible here," Sam admitted. "I've never seen it handled like this." John nodded quietly, returning to his work. The ranch needed results more than praise. Evenings were still quiet, but now they carried a different tone. John would sit on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the cattle in the slowly recovering fields. There was satisfaction in knowing that his efforts were making a tangible difference. The animals were healthier, the grass greener, and the creek alive once more. The ranch had survived, and John's careful planning and hard work had made it possible. One particularly hot afternoon, John encountered a challenge. Heavy rainfall upstream had caused water to flow too quickly into one of the channels he had built. The soil was soft and risked washing away. John sprang into action, using boards and rocks to reinforce the banks and divert the water safely. He worked tirelessly, the sweat soaking his shirt, the sun beating down on him, but he did not stop until the flow was steady and secure. That evening, exhausted but satisfied, he added new notes to his notebook, recording the adjustments and the results. By the end of the week, the creek was flowing steadily, the channels stable and the cattle healthy. John walked along the banks one last time for the day, observing every detail. He noted how the water reached each field, how the grass had revived, and how the animals moved more freely. He understood that the work was never truly finished. Nature was unpredictable, and constant attention was necessary. But he also knew that his actions had restored balance, at least for now. John's dedication caught the attention of local environmentalists. They came to observe his work, fascinated by the practical methods he had used to restore the creek. They studied his channels, dams, and reservoirs, taking notes and photographs. John shared his observations and findings, explaining how careful planning, routine observation, and consistent action had saved the ranch. The scientists were impressed, noting that his approach could serve as a model for other ranches facing similar water problems. Even as recognition grew, John remained humble. He knew that his work was about survival, responsibility, and love for the land. The ranch was not just property. It was a living system, and every small action mattered. He continued to check the creek 3 times a day, as he always had, recording details, monitoring water flow, and ensuring the cattle and fields thrived. His routine, once simple and habitual, had become the key to overcoming a crisis that could have destroyed everything he held dear. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the recovering fields, John stood by the creek and let the water flow through his fingers. It was cool and strong, a sign that the land was healing. The cattle grazed peacefully nearby, and the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced a challenge that threatened his ranch and had responded with patience, intelligence, and hard work. The crisis had tested him, but he had not wavered. Night fell and the stars began to twinkle above the ranch. John sat on the porch, drinking a warm cup of tea, reflecting on the past weeks. He thought about the land, the creek, and the animals. He realized that small, consistent actions, taken with care and attention, could create change far greater than he had imagined. His hands were rough and worn, his body tired, but his heart was full. The ranch was alive again, and so was his hope for the future. John McAllister understood something that night that he had always known deep down. True change, real solutions, and lasting results came from observation, patience, and consistent effort. One person, willing to act with care and determination, could make a difference. And on that ranch 3 times a day, John had made sure that life would continue, water would flow, and the land would thrive. After weeks of hard work, John McAllister could finally take a breath. The creek, once a thin, struggling line of water, now ran steadily through the ranch, feeding the pastures, nourishing the cattle, and giving life back to the fields. The difference was clear and remarkable. The cattle were healthier than they had been in months, moving freely across the lush green grass, drinking without worry. Even the calves, once sluggish and weak, now frolicked in the sunlight, their playful energy returning. John watched them with quiet pride, knowing that his persistent efforts had made all this possible. But John also knew that success in the short term was not enough. The ranch had survived, but the lessons of the drought and the creek's diversion had to be remembered and preserved. He began to focus on sustainability, thinking of ways to make sure the water would always flow, even during future dry seasons. He built small reservoirs in key areas of the ranch where rainwater could be stored for use when the creek ran low. He reinforced the banks further, planting grasses and shrubs that would prevent erosion and absorb water into the soil. But John approached the work slowly and thoughtfully, understanding that small, careful steps could make the greatest difference in the long run. Every day he continued his routine of walking the land 3 times a day, These walks had been his habit for decades, but now they had a new purpose: to observe, adjust, and maintain the changes he had made. Each morning he checked the creek's flow, ensuring that the channels were clear and that water reached every pasture. In the afternoons he inspected the fences and pastures, ensuring that no damage had occurred. And in the evenings he walked along the newly planted banks, watching the grass and trees slowly take root and making notes in his notebook. The rhythm of his life, once simple and repetitive, had become a vital part of protecting the ranch. Word of John's work began to spread beyond the ranch. Neighbors came to see what he had accomplished, amazed at the practical and effective methods he had used to restore the creek. Some brought questions, seeking advice on how to protect their own land from water shortages. John shared his knowledge freely, explaining how careful observation, consistent effort, and smart planning had made the difference. He showed them how small diversions, reservoirs, and reinforced banks could create a sustainable water system. The neighbors listened closely, taking notes and asking questions, inspired by his determination and success. It wasn't long before environmental experts and researchers took notice. They visited the ranch, curious about the techniques John had used. They walked with him along the creek, examined the channels, measured the water flow, and studied his notes. They asked detailed questions, and John answered each one patiently, explaining the steps he had taken and why. He spoke with a quiet authority that came from experience, from having lived with the land for decades, and from having learned through trial, observation, and persistence. The experts were impressed. They realized that John's approach could be applied to other ranches and farms across the region. His methods were practical, low-cost, and effective, relying on knowledge of the land rather than expensive machinery or complicated technology. They documented his work carefully, taking photographs and making detailed reports. John, humble as ever, allowed them to do so, understanding that sharing his knowledge could help others protect their land and livestock. As weeks turned into months, John's efforts began to have an even wider impact. Local farming groups invited him to speak about water management and sustainable ranching practices. He shared his story simply, in plain language, emphasizing observation, patience, and the value of routine. "Small actions every day can make a big difference," he would say, repeating a lesson he had learned firsthand. His message resonated with farmers and ranchers who had struggled with droughts and water shortages, showing them that even one determined person could influence change. Despite the growing attention and praise, John remained focused on his work at home. The ranch was his priority, and he knew that consistent attention would be necessary to maintain the creek and ensure the health of the land. Every day he continued to walk the property 3 times, checking the water, monitoring the cattle, and observing the fields. His notebook was filled with records of flow rates, rainfall, soil conditions, and animal behavior. It had become a living document, a map of the ranch's health, and a guide for future generations. John also began teaching his children and grandchildren about the importance of observation and care. They would walk with him along the creek, learning how to measure water levels, recognize signs of stress in cattle, and identify areas where the land needed attention. John emphasized that these lessons were about more than just ranching. They were about responsibility, patience, and respect for nature. He wanted them to understand that the land was not a tool to be used carelessly, but a living system that required attention, care, and thoughtful action. As the years passed, John's methods became a model for sustainable ranching in the region. Other ranchers began to implement similar water management systems, inspired by the success of his approach. Some even visited his ranch to observe firsthand how small channels, reservoirs, and reinforced banks could make a significant difference in water flow and land health. John welcomed them, guiding them patiently and sharing every lesson he had learned. His work was no longer just about saving his own ranch. It was about creating a legacy that could help countless others, The local community recognized John's contributions as well. Farmers' associations and environmental groups honored him for his innovation and dedication. He received awards, certificates, and letters of recognition, all acknowledging the importance of his work. Yet, John remained humble. The praise mattered little compared to the satisfaction of seeing the land thrive, the cattle healthy, and the creek flowing steadily once more. His greatest reward was the knowledge that his consistent efforts had made a lasting difference. Even in the quiet moments, John reflected on what he had accomplished. He remembered the long hours, the sweat, and the worry. He remembered the nights when he stayed up late, planning, measuring, and recording data. And he remembered the satisfaction of seeing the results, the first trickle of water returning to the dry creek, the first calves drinking eagerly, and the first green shoots of grass pushing through the soil. All of it was the result of consistent, thoughtful effort guided by knowledge and love for the land. One evening, after a long day of work, John stood by the creek, watching the water flow through the channels he had built. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the fields and cattle. The trees reflected in the calm water, and the air smelled fresh and sweet. He felt a deep sense of peace. The ranch was alive again, thriving, and ready to face future challenges. And he knew that the land would continue to thrive, not just because of his efforts, but because of the habits, lessons, and values he had passed down. The story of John McAllister became more than a local tale. It was a story of perseverance, responsibility, and the power of small, consistent actions. It showed that one person willing to observe carefully, act thoughtfully, and maintain dedication could create lasting change. People who visited the ranch, studied the methods, or heard the story took inspiration from it, applying the lessons in their own fields, creeks, and communities. John continued his routine every day, walking the land 3 times, observing, adjusting, and caring. The creek flowed steadily, the pastures were lush, and the cattle were healthy. The land, once fragile and threatened, had been restored and strengthened, and John, with his humble determination, became more than a rancher. He became a symbol of dedication, ingenuity, and the quiet but powerful impact of routine and responsibility. As the night fell, stars glittering above the ranch, John sat on the porch drinking a warm cup of tea. He reflected on the journey, the months of observation, the challenges, the long hours, and the careful planning. He thought about the generations before him, the lessons passed down, and the land that had shaped his life. And he smiled, knowing that he had not only saved the ranch, but had created a legacy, one that would continue to guide and inspire for years to come. The land was thriving, the creek flowed, the cattle grazed peacefully, and John McAllister, through patience, observation, and relentless dedication, had changed the course of his ranch's history. He had proven that small, consistent efforts, done with care and thoughtfulness, could overcome even the greatest challenges. And in that quiet, golden evening, with the world calm around him, John felt the true satisfaction of a life lived in harmony with nature, of a legacy created through perseverance, and of a story that would be remembered long after the sun had set.